Well, thank you for the song this morning. We'll be turning to Isaiah chapter 47. So, in our series through Isaiah, this is now message number 58, entitled Profaned Inheritance. So, we're going to be looking at chapter 47. Let's read verses 1 to 3 to get started. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground, there is no throne. O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind meal. Uncover thy locks, make bare the leg, uncover the thigh, pass over the rivers. Thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yea, thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. So chapter 46 vindicated God against the idols of Babylon. The idols were a burden to their makers and a burden to their worshipers. The idols couldn't stand or move of themselves, so they had to be carried. They had to be fixed into place, and it was a great burden to move them. And not only could they not stand or move or fix themselves, but they also could not prevent their being carried away by a conquering or invading nation. So the contrast is given in that chapter where God, the God of Israel, is not like the idols. Israel doesn't carry and bear God as a burden, but God carries his nation, Israel. And he uses imagery that would speak of a mother, like a mother carrying a baby, a young child. But of course, it goes far beyond that because mothers only carry their babies for a little while, and when they're young, but as they grow and things. But God carries Israel from the womb to old age. He ever carries and bears them up. And so God is also promised in that chapter that he will raise up a man to do his will. And Cyrus will lead the defeat of Babylon and will free the captives. And that has been a continual theme in this first section of part 2 of Isaiah, so chapters 42, 48. Now, chapter 47 is delivered as a word against Babylon. It's a particular word spoken against Babylon that is obviously giving confirmation to Israel. Babylon's rise is something that had been prophesied back in chapter 39, and their fall had also been prophesied back in chapters 13 and 14 in the woes to the nations. And of course, if they were going to fall, then that necessarily meant that they had to rise first. And so those two things obviously go together. But also we notice how that with Babylon, there's a mirroring of the pattern that we saw with Assyria. Assyria was the threat, and they were the rising threat at the very beginning of Isaiah's ministry. And so in the early parts of Isaiah, Assyria was raised up as a rod. God sends this word to Israel that Assyria was his rod. He was going to use Assyria to punish Israel, to punish other nations, to punish Judah as well. And so they conquered nations, and they conquered and they exiled the northern kingdom of Israel. They punished the southern kingdom of Judah quite heavily, though they did not conquer them. But Assyria, we find out, was proud and sinful, and they boasted in themselves. And so God promised that judgment would come on Assyria, and that judgment would come by raising up Babylon, who was going to supplant Assyria and bring about the downfall of the Assyrians. So even though Babylon at the time of this writing was still on the rise as a nation, as an empire, as a world power, they were still on the rise. They would follow a similar trajectory as this chapter here speaks to their downfall. So this chapter shows what we should describe as the inevitable judgment of Babylon. And this judgment of Babylon is inevitable because of their sins, and also because God is the Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, the Holy One of Israel, as is described in verse number 4. So if Babylon hasn't fully risen yet, how could their downfall be inevitable? Well, of course, this sets further distinction between God and the idols. But think back to chapter 39 and verses 5 to 7 that actually predicts the exile of Judah by Babylon. And so we're quite set up for what occurs here in chapter 47. So we want to look at this chapter in two parts. In verses 1 to 7, where Babylon is going to go from high to very low. And in verses 8 to 15, where it is emphasized that there is only one God. So we're going to start with the first part here. Let's look at verse number 1. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground. There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate. So Isaiah is using, and we've talked about it different times, the rhetorical skill of Isaiah in this particular prophecy. And it's something that as you read the Bible and you read the different authors, you can start to pick up on a sense of the different skill that is used in the writing. And that just had to do with the giftings of these different men that God used to write his word. But it's showing here because he's using a lot of imagery. He's using contrast. He's making up a progression. So he's depicting the fall of Babylon from the height of ascendancy as to essentially being a plummet to the depths of humiliation and disgrace. And so we see that immediately established. Come down, sit in the dust, sit on the ground. There is no throne. And as he proceeds, so we see this what we call the juxtaposition. He's putting these things together by way of contrast. And so he's presenting this image very, very vividly. Now, there is a seeming strange reference here. O virgin daughter of Babylon. That seems to be a very strange reference, a strange way of speaking of Babylon that was anything but anything except innocent and pure and what have you. So what is this imagery depicting, and how does it go along with what Isaiah is saying? Well, a royal virgin daughter, we might sometimes refer to as a princess, is used to luxury, is used to essentially everything being done for her and being brought to her. And so she's used to luxury, she's used to being waited on, and she's what we could say she's inexperienced in the harsher realities of the world. So if we were to try to put this in modern terms, then we could think of something like maybe a naive young lady who has grown up very isolated in some rural community, and she comes of age, and so she goes off to the big city. And she gets to the big city, and she's taken advantage of in every possible way, and essentially ends up penniless on the streets. So that sort of imagery that we can relate to in our modern time is exactly what Isaiah is showing us about what's going to happen to Babylon. So that's the reason why Babylon is being referred to as the virgin daughter of Babylon, and not because, again, of any innocence or moral purity on their part. And so you notice at the end of the verse that that her and her life essentially is no more going to be tender and delicate, the things that she's accustomed to. So this downfall is depicted as leading to a complete violation and exposure of Babylon. So we look at verses 2 and 3. Take the millstones and grind meal, uncover thy locks, make bare the leg, uncover the thigh, pass over the rivers. Thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yea, thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. So you may have heard verses 2 and 3 quoted. Oftentimes they're quoted or referred to as some sort of a lesson about feminine modesty. But that's a complete misappropriation that ignores this context. It has absolutely nothing to do with anything like that. What is Isaiah talking about? He's giving us a description. This is the imagery of going from that position of luxury and finery to the life of a slave. That's what he is depicting. No longer spending days in fine silks and fine garments and fine jewelry and all of that and being waited upon. No, she's going to be stripped and put to hard labor, which again was the common imagery and commonly what happened to slaves, those that had been conquered. So the stripping of captives by conquerors was a form of plunder. So on the one hand, the jewels and the fine garments were those things that were expensive, and that was a part of the wealth of a family, and so those things would be taken because of the intrinsic value that they had. But it was also a form of psychological conditioning. It was a way of essentially completely subjugating a people that had been conquered. So they would defeat it, and it would lead to them being more controllable and such. So even when you see like these messages about crossing the rivers, what's being referred to is either being carried away, being marched away in essence, as a captive, as a slave, or possibly fleeing in desperation. Though again, with the context, being marched away as a slave certainly makes more sense. But this verse also, here in verse number 3, makes a very important turn, because going to be put to, I mean, what greater humiliation could there be than for a member of the royal family, used to power, used to ruling, used to being catered to, being waited upon, living in luxury and all of these sort of things, to be reduced to a slave, marched away naked and wounded by the enemy nation. There's really just not much further humiliation that can come about. So it's what's being depicted to us. But this verse does make an important turn, because sometimes, and maybe even often, we think that a fall is the result of some sort of bad luck. We think that a fall is some sort of undeserved ill fortune, something that has just sort of happened to us. But this is being revealed beforehand so that Babylon and Israel would know that this is not a random or just some strange occurrence that has happened. No, it is God's vengeance. And you see that at the end of 3. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man, which essentially means that he will not spare. He will exhaust full divine wrath. This is judgment. And God's judgment is always righteous. And what that means is that God's judgment, when it comes, is judgment that is due. It's judgment that has been merited. It is a reward for sin, for rebellion, for wickedness, for evil, for unbelief, for all of these things. It is due. In other words, God's judgment does not fall randomly or capriciously or unfairly upon anyone. Now, men are oftentimes very quick to charge God with unfairness, but he never judges unfairly, even when fair judgment means the beating and the death of his Son from heaven on the cross for the salvation of sinners. Verse number 4. As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel. Again, this is a very pivotal portion here, the end of verse 3 and verse number 4, very pivotal portion in this chapter, in this word to Babylon. So following immediately after the explanation of Babylon's humiliation and disgrace is this affirmation for Israel. And notice this first person plural, our Redeemer. This is a confession of Yahweh as, first of all, as Redeemer. And yes, this is the word for kinsman redeemer, the one who redeems and rescues the near of kin at personal cost so that the family and the inheritance is preserved. That imagery that comes to us particularly from the Old Covenant law. He is Israel's Redeemer. He's also Lord of hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth, which means essentially the commander of armies. It's a title that is associated with judgment, where the Lord comes to do battle against his enemies and to deliver his nation. And Isaiah uses this title numerous times in his prophecy. And then he's also the Holy One of Israel. And this is a particular messianic title in Isaiah, and it indicates that the one God of Israel, the one who is above all earthly powers, is the preserver of the remnant of this nation. In other words, he's ultimately to be the redeemer and sanctifier of this nation. So the point here is to explain the actions of the Lord against Babylon. The Lord as Redeemer, as Lord of hosts, as the Holy One of Israel, makes Babylon's judgment and downfall inevitable. In other words, it cannot be otherwise. They stand opposed to the God of heaven. Verse number 5, sit thou silent and get thee into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called the Lady of Kingdoms. Now, being brought to silence is one who has been judged and can make no reply in defense. There's nothing that can be said to justify Babylon before God. They're brought to silence. Now, Babylon, of course, thought of itself as the queen of the kingdoms. That's sort of what the phrase indicates. And that their power would last forever. In other words, they achieved the height, they achieved the high position, and simply assumed that they would always be there, that they could just go on infinitely as they were. But God is indicating that it will end, and that it will end suddenly. Verse 6, I was wroth with my people. I have polluted mine inheritance and given them into thine hand. Thou didst show them no mercy. Upon the ancient hast thou very heavily laid thy yoke. So Babylon's ascendancy and Judah's exile are explained. My people, of course, is the singular with the possessive, my nation, referring to Israel. And God says he was angry. He was angry with them, and he gave them over, such that he profaned his inheritance. Now, Israel is described as God's inheritance or covenant possession back in chapter 19, verse 25. Recently in chapter 43 and verse number 21, and we were talking about how Isaiah uses the language of being created, of being formed, and being made, which are not synonymous, interchangeable terms, but they are related, and they all have something to say specifically about Israel in relation to God. So they are his covenant possession. And profaning his inheritance refers to removing protection and essentially giving them over to common treatment. In other words, he simply allowed them to be taken away, to be conquered, to be removed from off the land and scattered among the nations. Something that Israel thought could not happen. And it seems that even after it did happen with the northern kingdom, that still yet the southern kingdom thought, well, but we have Jerusalem. We have the temple. We have the priesthood. We have the sacrifices. We have the feasts. We have the Levites. We have all of these. So yes, that happened to northern Israel, but that cannot happen here. They thought that they could sin with immunity, and no matter how much that they rebelled, that this would not happen to them. God chose Israel and chose them to make them holy. They, on the other hand, profaned his name and profaned his covenant, and so God profaned them. He gave them over to common treatment, which refers to the exile judgment, even though he preserved a remnant, and he will ultimately sanctify them. Well, the charge against Babylon was that in their arrogancy, they were very harsh with their captives. Babylon, it said, showed no mercy. And so in turn, they will receive no mercy. This would, if we were in wisdom literature, we would refer to this as that wisdom reversal judgment. We saw it numerous times in the Psalms as well. They showed no mercy, and they will be shown no mercy in judgment. Verse 7, and thou saidst, I shall be a lady forever, so that thou didst not lay these things to thy heart, neither didst remember the latter end of it. Babylon thought of itself as supreme and everlasting. Now, even though Babylon would have Daniel and would have others to faithfully witness God's word to them, they would not consider it. They didn't lay it to heart. And instead, they thought of themselves in terms that can only be described as divine, supreme, and everlasting. That's how they thought of themselves. So now we get to where Babylon is brought to face the truth that there is only one God. And whatever king of Babylon or whatever ruling family that it might be, it certainly is not them. Verse number 8. Therefore, hear now this, thou that art given to pleasures, that dwellest carelessly, that sayest in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. Now, the therefore obviously shows that this is a conclusion. This is something that's coming from what has preceded it. And it shows that this really is the justification for this pronouncement of judgment. And their arrogance, their pride is directly addressed. They loved, and they loved pleasure. They pursued pleasure. They were at the height of their power. They believed themselves invincible. And you notice how they're even, again, using divine language here. I am and none else beside me, which mirrors the language of God in places like Isaiah chapter 45, verses 5 to 6, that there's none beside me. They thought themselves supreme in power and essentially insulated from devastation. Verse number 9, but these two things shall come to thee in a moment in one day, the loss of children and widowhood. They shall come upon thee in their perfection, for the multitude of thy sorceries, and for the great abundance of thine enchantments. So again, we're getting this wisdom reversal in light of their arrogance. Essentially, what in their pride they thought could not happen would happen, and it would happen suddenly. So what is described here is a judgment. It's not going to be some sort of long, slow descent from power where they just sort of crumble over time. No, they're going to reach the height, and they're going to be toppled in a day. And of course, we can read the description of that happening in Daniel chapter 5, verses 28 to 30. Now, he does refer here to their sorceries and enchantments, and that will continue in this part of this chapter. Now, whereas before we saw reference to their idols, and of course there's connections between all these things as well. The word that's used for sorceries here is actually quite a rare word in the Old Testament. It doesn't appear very often. And it particularly refers to seeking knowledge from the spirit realm. In other words, not seeking knowledge from God, not seeking knowledge from God's word or from God's prophet or anything like that, but seeking knowledge from the spirit realm, which ultimately means what? It means seeking knowledge from demons. That's what's being referred to. It is an attempt to try to gain information, to gain knowledge of the future, to gain something that can in some way be used to achieve some sort of victory or achieve some sort of end. Now, what is revealed here and referred to, and will be again later, is the fact that such knowledge is always unreliable. Sometimes it may have the ring of truth, may have aspects of truth to it, but it's always unreliable, and it's unable to deliver. So enchantments refer to various forms of conjurings, things that are trying to affect human behavior and are trying to control events. So basically, you have on the one hand the seeking of secret knowledge from the spirit realm. And then on the other hand, you have the trying to use essentially the power of the spirit realm in order to be able to control outcomes and control people and all of these sort of things. But the message is made very plain. All of this will be unable to prevent the downfall of Babylon. Verse number 10, for thou hast trusted in thy wickedness. Thou hast said, none seeth me. Thy wisdom and thy knowledge, it hath perverted thee. And thou hast said in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. So this arrogance that they thought insulated them from judgment, when we're getting a repetition from verse number 8, this divine claim of supremacy, which is equivalent to the boasting of Assyria that was condemned in earlier parts of Isaiah. All of their sorcerers and their astrologers and their fortune tellers and their spell makers, they only led them astray and confirmed them in their pride and ultimately led them to their downfall judgment. Verse 11, therefore shall evil come upon thee, thou shalt not know from whence it riseth, and mischief shall fall upon thee, thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know. So they're being assured calamity and destruction is going to come, and the magicians and the astrologers and all of that, they're not going to be able to warn them because their knowledge is going to fail. They're not going to be able to overcome this or put it off. I think the language that's used here, that's actually a word that's commonly translated atone or atonement. They're not going to be able to cover or cleanse. In other words, the statement is that this judgment is sealed and it's without remedy. It's irremediable in their case. Verse number 12, stand now with thine enchantments and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be, thou shalt be able to profit. If so be, thou mayest prevail. So this is a direct challenge, and we've seen this before, except it's mainly come in a direct challenge issued to the idols. So the idols and the nations are called to come forth and to bring forth their evidence of their idols being able to tell of the future and to bring those things to pass. So it's a direct challenge that's very similar to that, but this again is issued to all of the magicians and such of Babylon, which they were famous for. And they are called to stand against God with all their sorceries and those that had been present from Babylon's founding, that's referred to a couple times in this chapter as well, and just see if they can prevail. And of course, history has shown, just as was prophesied, that they did not. Verses 13 and 14. Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. So again, this call goes out for all the counselors and the stargazers and all of those things. Stand up and oppose God and see if they're able to prevent this destruction from coming. And the word that's given is that they're just going to be like so much dry stubble before a fire. And dry stubble before a fire is just quickly consumed. In other words, it's unable to resist. It's unable to resist burning. Now, this fire, he goes on to describe, it's not going to be like the fire that he referred to in these previous preceding chapters, the fire of the idol makers back in chapter 44. Remember how he talked about they would use that fire and they would cook a meal and they would warm themselves by it and they would use it in the shaping and the fashioning of their idols and all of these sort of things. Well, this is a consuming fire of judgment. This isn't a fire they're going to warm themselves by. This is a fire that's going to burn up everything, consume everything in its path, and leave nothing behind it. Verse 15, thus shall they be unto thee with whom thou hast labored, even thy merchants from thy youth. They shall wander every one to his quarter, none shall save thee. So all of, again, the counselors and the magicians and the soothsayers and those that they have even of other nations that they have sort of trafficked with, those things, those that have led them. One thing that's being pointed out in this chapter is how all of those different sources have led to different conclusions. All those different sources are leading in various ways, whether you're looking at the astrologers or whether you're looking at the fortune tellers or whether you're looking at the sorcerers or talking about the charmers or whoever that it is. In other words, they all sort of have their own way, their own idea, and they've led Babylon here and there and back and forth with their own solution. Now, ultimately, he says they're all going to fail. But notice what we get in contrast, and that is that God's message is one. It is unified. It is a coherent message that will come to pass without fail. Unlike the diverse messages of the astrologers and the sorcerers and so on. So as we look at this chapter and we see this word that is spoken to Babylon, again, before Babylon had actually risen to their height, it's prophesied they'll get to their height, but then they're going to be brought down to the depths, and that's going to happen suddenly, and that is what played out historically as well. So as we look at this chapter and we think about the scope of application beyond just Babylon and Israel, we've already seen the similarity with Assyria, and so if we're looking for just sort of that broad message, we read a chapter like this and we have to understand that sin will be judged. Judgment against sin is inevitable. No matter how long that it seems like it's delayed. And really, it doesn't matter how things may be seeming to go in any moment. So in any moment of time, we may be doing very well. We may be doing okay. We may be doing very bad. But it doesn't really matter how that we're doing. Right now, maybe everything seems good. And when everything seems good, it's easy for us to put off repentance because we think, well, everything's okay. So what I'm doing must be all right. The things I've done, the choices I've made, everything seems to be working out okay. I don't have to worry about this message of God. One of the common ways that I've heard the Bible and Christianity described by those self-satisfied and self-insulated, anti-religionists. Oh, that's just a crutch. That's just a crutch for weak-minded people because their lives are terrible, and so they need something to help them get through the day. My life, on the other hand, is great, and so I don't need any word from God. And so if everything is okay, it's easy for us to just sort of put that off and to think, well, I don't really have any problems or nothing too major. Well, Israel was to understand that there was a reason for their suffering. And there was meaning in their suffering, this judgment that was coming upon them. And that meaning was not that they were forsaken or that they would be, but that they were profaned in order to be sanctified. And again, there's a realization there for all of us to come to terms with that sin inevitably will be judged. And there is no deliverance from it outside of forgiveness through the Lord Jesus Christ. All right, we will stop here and close with a hymn.
Jesus saves.